On the night of July 16, 1779, a brigadier general named Anthony Wayne stood at the base of a cliff on the Hudson River, staring up at a British fort his own officers had called impossible to take. He had ordered every musket in his advance columns unloaded. No man was permitted to fire a single shot until the fort was already breached. If discovered early, 1,300 Americans would be climbing a rock face into a wall of grape shot and musket fire with nothing but bayonets in their hands. His own men had started to call him mad before the attack even began. By morning, the nickname would stick for the rest of his life. And the strange part of the story is this. The plan that earned him the name Mad Anthony Wayne wasn't reckless at all. It was one of the most disciplined, precisely engineered assaults of the entire Revolutionary War. So how does a man become famous for insanity? By being, in reality, almost unbearably controlled. To understand why Wayne was standing on that riverbank, you have to go back 2 years, to a disaster that never quite left him. In September of 1777, at a place called Paoli, Pennsylvania, Wayne's troops were bivouacked for the night, resting after weeks of hard marching through the Pennsylvania countryside as the British campaign for Philadelphia ground forward. A British force under General Charles Grey crept in under cover of darkness and struck without warning, using bayonets alone to keep the attack silent, ordering their own men to pull the flints from their muskets so that no accidental shot would give away the approach. The result was a slaughter later remembered by Americans as the Paoli Massacre. Roughly 13% of Wayne's men were killed outright, and another 7% wounded, an inversion of the normal ratio of casualties in 18th century combat, where wounded men usually outnumbered the dead by 3 to 1. Word of the disaster spread through the army and through the Pennsylvania countryside within days, and Wayne, as the officer who had commanded the camp that night, faced formal accusations that he had been negligent in posting his sentries. He demanded a court-martial to clear his name rather than let the accusation sit unanswered, and the court found the surprise had been the product of enemy skill and darkness rather than any failure on his part. But the vindication didn't erase the memory. Paoli wasn't just a defeat. It was a lesson burned into Wayne's mind about what a well-executed night attack with cold steel could do to an army that never saw it coming. He had been on the receiving end of exactly the kind of operation he would one day lead himself, and in the 2 years that followed, something in him seemed to be waiting for the chance to prove he had learned the lesson completely, on his own terms, against the men who had taught it to him. Anthony Wayne was, on paper, an unlikely figure for a legend built on madness. He had trained as a surveyor and run a tannery business in Chester County, Pennsylvania, before the war. And he had sat in the colonial assembly as a political figure with no formal military pedigree behind him. He wasn't a career soldier from a grand military family, the way so many British officers across the river were, men who had bought commissions and studied at Sandhurst, or served under fathers and uncles who had done the same. Wayne was a local landowner who joined the Continental cause early and rose through the ranks the hard way, by proving himself under fire again and again, at Trois-Rivières in the failed Canadian campaign, at Brandywine, at Germantown, and at Monmouth. At Monmouth, in June of 1778, Wayne's men made first contact with the British as they marched across New Jersey in the punishing summer heat. And it was Wayne who held a defensive line under brutal pressure after his superior, Major General Charles Lee, refused to commit reinforcements, and the young Continental Army nearly collapsed in confusion on the field. Wayne pulled his men back from the full force of the British onslaught rather than let them be destroyed piecemeal, and he fought a desperate holding action in an orchard near the center of the battlefield that bought Washington the time he needed to stabilize the line and eventually force a standoff. By 1779, Wayne had a reputation among his fellow officers as a man who could be trusted with the hardest, most exposed assignments, precisely because he did not panic and he did not improvise under pressure. Everything he did in battle was the product of planning, not instinct, which makes the nickname that followed him all the more ironic, since the very quality that made him reliable was the opposite of what the word mad usually implies. By the summer of 1779, the war in the Northern Theatre had settled into a grinding stalemate. Neither Washington nor the British commander in New York, General Sir Henry Clinton, had the strength to force a decisive battle, and London was growing impatient with a war that seemed to be going nowhere after 4 years of fighting and mounting cost. Clinton, under pressure to produce some kind of result for a government losing patience, decided to threaten the Hudson Highlands, the vital supply and communication corridor that connected New England to the rest of the rebelling colonies. In late May of 1779, British forces seized 2 points along the river, Stony Point and Verplancks Point, fortifying the high ground at Stony Point with earthworks, mounted cannon emplacements, and a defensive belt of sharpened abatis, felled trees with their branches trimmed to points, and laid facing outward to slow any attacker crossing the open ground beneath the walls. The position sat on a rocky promontory jutting into the river, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that flooded at high tide, effectively turning the fort into an island twice a day. British engineers considered the terrain itself a natural fortification, rough, hilly, strewn with boulders, and nearly impossible to approach quickly, let alone silently. Soldiers on both sides had taken to calling it Little Gibraltar, a nod to the supposedly impregnable British fortress on the Mediterranean, and Clinton was confident enough in the position that he left it garrisoned with a relatively modest force while he turned his attention elsewhere. Washington saw the position differently, and more urgently, than the British did. Stony Point sat only about 12 miles downriver from West Point, the linchpin of the entire American defensive network on the Hudson, and a fortress Washington considered essential to the survival of the rebellion itself. If the British consolidated their hold at Stony Point, they could threaten the crossing points the Continental Army depended on to move supplies and reinforcements between New England and the Middle States, potentially splitting the American war effort in two along the length of the river. Washington needed the position back, but he also needed something just as badly, something that no amount of ground could provide on its own. After the harsh winter at Valley Forge and years of demoralizing retreats, after Paoli and a string of engagements that had gone the wrong way, the Continental Army needed proof, to itself and to the world watching from Europe, that it could still win a fight on hard terms against professional British regulars in a fixed, fortified position, rather than only through the slow attrition of a long war of maneuver. Washington turned to Wayne, and together the two men built a plan around a single guiding principle: speed and silence would accomplish what firepower could not. Wayne would lead a hand-picked force of light infantry, roughly 1,350 men drawn from regiments across the army, specifically for their discipline, physical endurance, and steadiness under fire, against a garrison of somewhere between 600 and 700 British troops under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Johnson. The attack would happen at midnight in 3 separate columns, each with a distinct role in a single coordinated design. 2 columns, one under Wayne himself, moving along the southern approach through the tidal marsh, and one under Colonel Richard Butler along the northern flank, would advance with fixed bayonets and empty muskets. No man in either column could load his weapon before the fort was breached, on pain of instant execution. If he disobeyed, a rule Wayne enforced without exception, because a single accidental shot could unravel the entire operation before it began. A third, smaller detachment under Major Hardy Murphy would create a diversion in the center of the American line, firing muskets and making noise to draw the garrison's attention away from the true axis of the assault developing on the flanks in silence. Ahead of each of the 2 main columns marched engineers and pioneer troops armed with axes, tasked with hacking narrow paths through the rows of abatis, blocking the approach to the walls, work that had to be done almost silently in complete darkness, with an armed garrison sleeping less than a few hundred yards away. At the very head of each column, Wayne selected small groups of 20 volunteers known as the Forlorn Hope, a term borrowed from European siege warfare for men whose job was to be first through the enemy's defenses, accepting the highest odds of death in exchange for opening the path for everyone behind them. Volunteering for the Forlorn Hope was considered an honor rather than a punishment, and Wayne had more men offer themselves for it than he had places to fill. A detail that says something about the trust his soldiers placed in a plan that looked, from the outside, like it asked them to walk directly into their own deaths. This is the moment in the planning that made even Wayne's own soldiers begin to question his sanity out loud. Ordering trained infantrymen to march toward armed fortifications with unloaded weapons, relying entirely on cold steel and darkness, went against every instinct of self-preservation a soldier carried into battle, and against most of the conventional military wisdom of the era, which generally treated firepower as the deciding factor in any assault on a fortified position. One account, repeated by men who served under him and later recorded in regimental histories of the campaign, has Wayne turning to his officers the evening before the attack and telling them plainly that if he fell during the assault, they were to carry him forward into the fort so that he could die inside it rather than watching the outcome from the rear. Whether every word of that exchange survives exactly as spoken, the spirit of it was true to the man, and it was about to be tested for real within a matter of hours. He was asking soldiers who trusted him to walk into a fortified position with empty muskets on his word alone, and he was prepared to prove his own trust in the plan with his body, not just his orders. At around 11:30 at night on July 16th, the columns began to move. The tide was fully in, turning the causeway into knee-deep water that Wayne's southern column had to wade through in complete darkness, muskets and cartridge boxes held above their heads, boots sinking into thick mud with every step forward. Each man close enough to the man beside him to feel his breathing, but unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. Every splash risked waking the garrison above them. Every stumble in the dark could send a man's weapon clattering against rock and bring British sentries down on the entire column before a single American had reached the base of the hill. The pioneers moved first, working their axes through the barrier of sharpened branches in near total silence, clearing gaps just wide enough for one man at a time to pass through, while behind them the forlorn hope waited in the mud, and behind them the main columns began climbing terrain steep enough in places that men needed both hands free just to keep from sliding back down the slope they had already gained, muskets slung uselessly across their backs, since there was nothing to fire them with anyway. They were discovered before they reached the top. British sentries on the northern approach spotted movement in the darkness and opened fire, and for a moment the entire plan hung on a single question. Would panic break the columns before they reached the walls, the way sudden contact so often unraveled night operations that looked flawless on paper the moment the first shot rang out and the element of surprise collapsed? It didn't. Wayne's men pressed forward at a dead run rather than freezing under fire, using the very confusion and darkness that had almost exposed them to close the remaining distance before the garrison could properly form a defense in the dark against an enemy whose exact position and numbers they couldn't see. It was in this chaos, climbing toward the fort under active musket fire with bayonets fixed and muskets still unloaded, that a British ball grazed the side of Wayne's head. He went down hard, stunned, blood running down his face into his collar, and for a moment the men nearest him believed their general had been killed outright. Wayne refused to be carried to the rear. According to accounts passed down from officers present that night, he ordered his aides to help him back to his feet, and when he found he could still stand, he insisted on being supported forward rather than left behind, telling the men around him that he would enter the fort, even if the wound killed him once it was done. His aides helped him up, and the assault continued with Wayne at its head, sword raised, refusing to fall behind his own advancing men, even as blood ran down the side of his face and soaked into the collar of his uniform. The two American columns converged from north and south almost simultaneously, catching the garrison in a pincer. They had no way to organize a coordinated defense against in the dark and confusion of a night attack they hadn't fully anticipated. British troops, trained for volley fire in open formation on a conventional battlefield, found themselves instead fighting hand-to-hand against bayonets inside a chaotic, cramped fortification, where their numerical disadvantage in close combat became total the moment the lines met, and there was no room left to reload or retreat to a second position. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson attempted to rally a defense at the center of the works, but the position was already collapsing around him within minutes of the first contact, as American soldiers poured over the earthworks from two directions at once, and the garrison found itself surrounded before it had fully understood it was under attack at all, let alone by which direction the main threat was coming from. The entire engagement, from the first shots on the northern flank to the fort's surrender, lasted no more than 25 to 30 minutes, an almost absurdly short span of time for what had been weeks of careful planning behind it. If the level of detail in this account already feels different from the version of Stony Point most people have heard, if you've never actually heard the specifics of the Causeway crossing or the forlorn hope before tonight, that gap is exactly why this channel exists. Every week means another battle, where the popular shorthand version gets replaced with what the primary sources and the historians who've spent careers on this material actually say happened. So if that's useful to you, subscribing costs nothing and it means you don't miss the next one. By 1 in the morning, it was over. American troops held the fort completely. Wayne, blood still drying on the side of his face from his head wound, dictated a brief message to be carried immediately to Washington, at his headquarters some miles away. The words he sent that night have survived in Washington's own correspondence. Short, almost understated, given the scale of what had just happened. The fort and garrison, with Colonel Johnson, are ours, and our officers and men behaved like men who are determined to be free. It is a small handful of words, but it carries the weight of a man who had planned every second of an operation that could easily have collapsed into catastrophe at any one of a dozen points along the way, and who now finally had physical proof in his hands, written in his own hand despite his wound, that it hadn't. The numbers told the rest of the story with brutal clarity. American losses were 15 killed and 83 wounded. British losses were 20 killed, 74 wounded, and 472 men captured, along with the fort's entire stock of artillery and stores. A garrison of 600 to 700 professional British soldiers had been overwhelmed and effectively removed from the war in under half an hour, at a fraction of the cost the British themselves had inflicted on Wayne's own men at Paoli 2 years earlier. It was, in the plainest military terms available, one of the most efficient and lopsided victories of the entire war for the Continental Army, and it had been won with bayonets alone against a defended, fortified position that professional engineers on both sides had considered nearly unapproachable only hours before. There is one detail about the aftermath that deserves real attention, because it complicates any easy narrative of righteous revenge for Paoli, and it's a detail that rarely survives the shorter version of this story. Wayne's men had every reason, and in the chaos of the moment, every opportunity, to repay the British in kind for the massacre 2 years earlier, the way armies on both sides of this war frequently did when old scores came due. They did not. American officers moved through the captured fort, actively preventing retaliatory killings in the minutes after the surrender, physically stepping between angry soldiers and disarmed prisoners, and the command structure gave quarter and mercy to the surrendered garrison, rather than allowing the kind of reprisal that Paoli, in the eyes of angry soldiers who had lost friends there, might easily have justified in the heat of the moment. It says something about the discipline Wayne demanded from his men, even in the middle of victory, that the same control which let them execute an almost impossible night assault also kept them from becoming exactly what they had set out to punish 2 years earlier. Strategically, the victory was almost paradoxical in its limits, and this is the part of the story that often gets left out entirely because it complicates the triumphant version most people prefer to tell. Washington arrived at Stony Point the next day to inspect the captured position himself and made a hard calculation on the spot, one that had nothing to do with the bravery of the men who had taken it. Holding the fort meant holding an isolated position, cut off from the rest of the Continental Army's defensive network. And if the British Navy returned upriver in force, as it easily could within days, the American garrison there could be surrounded and retaken at a cost that wasn't worth paying for a position with no permanent strategic value on its own once the element of surprise was spent. Within days, Washington ordered the fortifications destroyed and the position abandoned, taking the captured artillery, ammunition, and supplies back with the army as it withdrew to safer ground. In pure territorial terms, Stony Point gained the Americans nothing permanent at all. The ground that 1,300 men had bled to take under cover of darkness was given back to the landscape almost as quickly as it had been seized, and within a week, British engineers were free to reoccupy the ruins if they had chosen to. But territory was never really what this particular battle was about, and everyone on both sides of the war understood that within weeks of the assault. News of the operation spread through the American colonies and reached Europe not long after, carried in dispatches and printed in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. And it did something that no single piece of land could ever have accomplished on its own. It proved, in the most public and undeniable way possible, that American troops could execute a complex, disciplined night operation against professional British regulars entrenched in a fortified position, and win decisively, without artillery, without a numerical advantage worth mentioning, relying purely on planning, silence, and nerve. After years of retreats, after Valley Forge, after a war that seemed at times to be grinding toward exhaustion rather than any kind of victory, Stony Point became a symbol that the Continental Army had matured into a force capable of the kind of precision warfare that European armies took pride in and rarely credited to colonial militia fighting a rebellion. It restored morale at a moment in the war when morale was arguably worth more than any single strip of riverside ground. And it gave Congress and foreign observers alike a reason to believe the war was still winnable. There is an old, recurring pattern in military history where a commander's greatest reputation comes not from being remembered as brilliant, but from being remembered as slightly unhinged. Right up until the exact moment the plan works and the label flips entirely into its opposite. Consider a much later, very different example from a different war on a different continent. During the Crimean War, at the Battle of Balaclava in 1854, the Highland Brigade under Sir Colin Campbell famously chose to meet a massive Russian cavalry charge, not in the traditional defensive square formation that military doctrine of the era demanded, but in a single thin line, only 2 ranks deep, a formation that any standard tactical manual of the time would have called an open invitation to disaster. Campbell's own officers reportedly questioned whether he had lost his senses, forming a line so thin that any gap in it would let cavalry through to slaughter the infantry standing behind it with nowhere to run. Campbell trusted the discipline of his soldiers and the accuracy of their volley fire over the safety of textbook convention, and the line held its ground under the charge, breaking the Russian cavalry and passing into legend afterward as the Thin Red Line. The pattern repeats itself across centuries and across continents. An unconventional commander gets branded reckless or mad by the standards and doctrines of his own moment, right until the instant his unconventional judgment turns out to have been exactly correct, at which point the label of madness quietly and permanently turns into a badge of genius that follows him for the rest of his career. Anthony Wayne carried the nickname Mad Anthony for the rest of his military career, through his later campaigns against Native American confederacies in the Northwest Territory during the 1790s, all the way to his decisive victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, which effectively ended organized resistance in the region and opened the Ohio country to American settlement for decades afterward. The nickname followed him into history books, and it followed him into the names of cities, counties, and forts across the country that still carry his name today. Fort Wayne, Indiana, among the most prominent of them, a city that grew up around a fort named for a man history still half remembers as a lunatic. But the record left behind by the men who actually fought beside him at Stony Point, and by Washington himself in his own private correspondence, tells a very different story than the nickname on its surface implies. Wayne did not win at Stony Point by being reckless. He won by being almost obsessively deliberate, by removing every variable he could control: silence, timing, weapon discipline, the exact routes through the marsh and up the rock face, and by trusting his hand-picked men to hold their nerve through the one variable no amount of planning could ever fully eliminate: the fog of a battle that no commander, however careful, can completely predict once the first shot is fired and the plan meets an enemy who has plans of his own. The site of Stony Point still stands today above the Hudson River as a quiet state historic park, where visitors can walk the same rocky slope Wayne's men climbed in total darkness, and stand at almost the exact spot where a wounded general refused to be left behind his own charge. If there's a single line worth carrying away from this one, it might be this: history rarely remembers its most careful men as careful. It remembers them instead as either fools or geniuses, and it lets the outcome of a single night decide which word survives into the textbooks handed down afterward. Anthony Wayne planned his way, methodically and almost obsessively, into a legend that called him insane for it, and he never seemed to mind the nickname once it stuck. If stories like this one, where the popular label and the actual historical record pull in completely opposite directions, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing means you won't miss the next commander history has quietly misjudged in exactly this way. And if there's another general or officer you think has been unfairly branded a fool, a coward or a lunatic by popular memory, when the record says something else entirely, put the name in the comments, because that's usually exactly where the next video on this channel starts.